A number of years ago, in the Virginia coastline, a couple was getting ready to have a baby. They had already had 2 little boys, stair-step, one, then a year later, another. Now they were expecting their third only a year after that. The challenge was that they weren't well-to-do. The dad was an alcoholic. The mother, while pregnant, contracted cancer. They went ahead and had the little boy, but 11 months afterward, the mother would die. She would die from 2 things. She would die from just the exhaustion that cancer brings, and let alone cancer with 3 little boys under the age of 3. Add to that an alcoholic husband. Now, you've probably been around some alcoholics, and you know that sometimes when alcoholics get drunk, they get really funny. But on the far greater proportion, when they get drunk, they get abusive. And the people they most often get abusive with are, unfortunately, the people who are closest to them. That home was no exception. So that when he got drunk, he would take it out on the family. And after 11 months of cancer, 3 little boys of age 3 and less, and just the abuse that comes in an alcoholic home, that young wife determined it was easier to give up the fight than to keep on fighting. And so she died. That left those 3 little boys with an alcoholic dad who was in the military and decided the priority of his life was not the little guys. So he would keep them while it made him feel good, but when he got tired of them, he'd throw them out to anybody who would take them off his hands until he felt guilty, or until he needed a crutch. And then he'd pull them back from wherever they might be until he got tired and throw them out again. And that went on and on and on. And it went from bad to worse, like so many of those situations do. The little boys didn't have much hope for a good future. Meanwhile, over in southern Illinois, there was another couple, a couple who had never finished high school. They had been raised very differently. The wife had been raised in a very conservative Christian home as an only child. The husband, he was an illegitimate child, the result of a rape of a businessman to a teenage girl. The businessman refused to acknowledge even that the boy had been born, and so he was thrown to the girl's parents, an alcoholic granddad and a grandmother, to raise him the best they could. By the age 13, he was in a gang. By the age 15, seriously stabbed. Then he had met this single girl who had been raised in a Christian home, and unpredictably, they fell in love and got married. And then they wanted to have children. They tried 4 times. 3 were miscarriages. The last would be a stillbirth. But unfortunately, the stillbirth wouldn't be discovered for some time. And when they did, and cut in to remove the dead child, they would find a lot of peritonitis already having set in the womb and poisoning the mother's system. When they saved her life and cleaned her out, they said, "There's one thing we must tell you, you'll never be able to have children, and if you do, it'll most likely kill you." Heartbroken, they wondered what were they going to do, having wanted children, now with the hope of having none. That's when they heard about these 3 little boys that had been thrown from place to place and house to house and person to person all the way from the East Coast. When they heard where they were being kept, they went and knocked on the door. A gruff lady came and said, "Yeah, what do you want?" And when they opened the door, they said, "We understand you've got 3 little boys. We would love to have a child. Can we help with 1, 2, or all 3 if we need to?" Her response was that the 2 older ones had been already taken, but the brat, well, he was still in the back because nobody wanted him. They went back, and there they found the little guy, filthy, hadn't been cleaned and washed in weeks, literally. Smelled. He hadn't been changed, though he was beyond the time of really needing to be changed. Nobody had ever taught him how to be potty trained, so he would just dirty himself and they'd leave it that way. Dirt would be so caked into the creases in his knees and in his elbows that they would take literally weeks to scrub out and get clean. And then he would be covered over his entire body, approximately 75% with severe impetigo. Now, if you've never seen that, it's like almost a leprosy. Open sores, pus everywhere. It's disgusting. But on that day, that wife knelt down to that little boy, picked him up and said, "We'll take him." And the first place she took him was to a doctor's office, setting him on the examining table. When the doctor walked in, opened the door, and then caught a glimpse of the child, his first response was, "My God, what do you want with that?" You know, it really hadn't changed much. Our society still feels if you've got brains, beauty, brawn, or bucks, you're valuable. But if you don't, and even worse, if you don't look good and smell good and act good, you're real disposable. But on that day, that uneducated and rather poor young wife said, "I'll tell you what we want with him. If somebody like us doesn't give him the chance to become everything God created him to be, maybe nobody ever will." As a result, that couple invested their life in that little guy for the rest of his life. And today, that little guy is me.